Over the course of Timeless Terrors, we've explored hundreds of stories together, journeying through haunted landscapes, forgotten ruins, spectral visitations, and the darkest corners of human imagination. Tonight's collection is a hand-picked, curated selection of tales that showcase the remarkable range of classic horror, weird fiction, and supernatural telling. Within these pages, you'll encounter grotesque humor, lingering ghosts, cruel twists of fate, ancient fears rising from the sea, and the unsettling realization that the world is often far stranger than it first appears. Featuring unforgettable works from Edgar Allan Poe, Ambrose Bierce, and Robert Howard. So dim the lights once again, settle into your favorite armchair, and leave the modern world far, far behind you. Welcome to this special collection, Volume 15 of Timeless Terrors. Timeless Terrors, Volume 15, performed for you by Jonathan Dunne. Production and narration copyright 2026, Jonathan Dunne. Welcome back to Timeless Terrors. Tonight's episode is 108, King Pest by Edgar Allan Poe. Yes, the one and only. Some stories don't start in books. They start as whispers, in dark taverns, behind doors people have long since locked. I first heard this one from a sailor. He swore he had stumbled into a gathering in London no living man should ever see. He wasn't sure anyone was meant to survive it, and that was long ago, in a part of London where most people avoided. That sailor found a gathering, grotesque, strange, like a court of the damned it was. And some say the laughter still echoes there. This tale was written by the master of the macabre himself, Edgar Allan Poe, first published in 1835. It's a darkly comic nightmare, to be sure. A story of pestilence, drunken misadventure, and horrors both absurd and unsettling. And remember, the king himself said it best. Be merry, be jolly, but leave your doors bolted in the plague-stricken streets. King Pest, written by Edgar Allan Poe, narrated for you by Jonathan Dunne. Original year of publication 1835. This work is in the public domain. Production and narration copyright 2026. Jonathan Dunne. A tale containing an allegory. The gods do bear and will allow in kings the things which they abhor in rascal roots. Buckhurst's tragedy of Ferret and Porret. About 12 o'clock, one night in the month of October, and during the chivalrous reign of the 3rd Edward, two seamen belonging to the crew of the Free and Easy, a trading schooner plying between Sleece and the Thames, and then at anchor in that river, were much astonished to find themselves seated in the tap-room of an alehouse in the parish of St. Andrews, London, which alehouse bore for sign the portraiture of a jolly tar. The room, although ill-contrived, smoke-blackened, low-pitched, and in every other respect agreeing with the general character of such places at the period, was nevertheless, in the opinion of the grotesque groups scattered here and there within it, sufficiently well adapted to its purpose. Of these groups, our two seamen formed, I think, the most interesting, if not the most conspicuous. The one who appeared to be the elder, and whom his companion addressed by the characteristic appellation of Legs, was at the same time much the taller of the two. He might have measured 6 feet and a half, and an habitual stoop in the shoulders seemed to have been the necessary consequence of an altitude so enormous. Superfluities in height were, however, more than accounted for by deficiencies in other respects. He was exceedingly thin, and might, as his associates asserted, have answered when drunk for a pennant at the masthead, or when sober have served for a jib boom. But these jests and others of a similar nature had evidently produced, at no time, any effect upon the cachinnatory muscles of the tar, With high cheekbones, a large hawk nose, retreating chin, falling underjaw, and huge protruding white eyes, the expression of his countenance, although tinged with a species of dogged indifference to matters and things in general, was not the less utterly solemn and serious beyond all attempts at imitation of description. The younger seaman was, in all outward appearance, the converse of his companion. His stature could not have exceeded 4 feet. A pair of stumpy bow legs supported his squat, unwieldy figure, while his unusually short and thick arms, with no ordinary fists at their extremities, swung off dangling from his sides like the fins of a sea turtle. Small eyes of no particular colour twinkled far back in his head. His nose remained buried in the mass of flesh which enveloped his round, full, and purple face, and his thick upper lip rested upon the still thicker one beneath with an air of complacent self-satisfaction, much heightened by the owner's habit of licking them at intervals. He evidently regarded his tall shipmate with a feeling, half wondrous, half quizzical, and stared up occasionally in his face as the red setting sun stares up at the crags of Ben Nevis. Various and eventful, however, had been the peregrinations of the worthy couple in and about the different tap houses of the neighbourhood during the earlier hours of the night. Funds, even the most ample, are not always everlasting, and it was with empty pockets our friends had ventured upon the present hostelry. At the precise period, then, when this history properly commences, Legs and his fellow Hugh Tarpaulin sat, each with both elbows resting upon the large oaken table in the middle of the floor, and with a hand upon either cheek. They were eyeing from behind a huge flagon of unpaid-for humming stuff the portentous words, "No chalk," which, to their indignation and astonishment, were scored over the doorway by means of that very mineral whose presence they purported to deny. Not that the gift of deciphering written characters, a gift among the commonalty of that day considered little less cabalistical than the art of inditing, could in strict justice have been laid to the charge of either disciple of the sea. But there was, to say the truth, a certain twist in the formation of the letters, an indescribable lee lurch about the whole, which foreboded, in the opinion of both seamen, a long run of dirty weather, and determined them at once, in the allegorical words of Legs himself, to "pump ship, clew up all sail, and scud before the wind." Having accordingly disposed of what remained of the ale, and looped up the points of their short doublets, they finally made a bolt for the street, although Tarpaulin rolled twice into the fireplace, mistaking it for the door. Yet their escape was at length happily effected, and half after 12 o'clock found our heroes ripe for mischief, and running for life down a dark alley in the direction of St. Andrew's Stair, hotly pursued by the landlady of the Jolly Tar. At the epoch of this eventful tale, and periodically for more years before and after, all England, but more especially the metropolis, resounded with the fearful cry of plague. The city was in a great measure depopulated, and in those horrible regions in the vicinity of the Thames, where amid the dark, narrow, and filthy lanes and alleys, the demon of disease was supposed to have had his nativity, awe, terror, and superstition were alone to be found stalking abroad. By authority of the king, such districts were placed under ban, and all persons forbidden, under pain of death, to intrude upon their dismal solitude. Yet neither the mandate of the monarch, nor the huge barriers erected at the entrances of the streets, nor the prospect of that loathsome death with almost absolute certainty overwhelmed the wretch whom no peril could deter from the adventure, prevented the unfurnished and untenanted dwellings from being stripped by the hand of nightly rapine of every article, such as iron, brass, or leadwork, which could in any manner be turned to a profitable account. Above all, it was usually found upon the annual winter opening of the barriers that locks, bolts, and secret cellars had proved but slender protection to those rich stores of wines and liquors which, in consideration of the risk and trouble of removal, many of the numerous dealers having shops in the neighbourhood had consented to trust, during the period of exile, to so insufficient a security. But there were very few of the terror-stricken people who attributed these doings to the agency of human hands. Pest spirits, plague goblins, and fever demons were the popular imps of mischief, and tales so blood-chilling were hourly told, that the whole mass of forbidden buildings was at length enveloped in terror as in a shroud, and the plunderer himself was often scared away by the horrors his own depreciations had created, leaving the entire vast circuit of prohibited district to gloom, silence, pestilence, and death. It was by one of the terrific barriers already mentioned, and which indicated the region beyond to be under the pest ban, that, in scrambling down an alley, Legs and the worthy Hugh Tarpaulin found their progress to be lost, as their pursuers were close upon their heels. With thoroughbred seamen to clamber up the roughly fashioned plankwork was a trifle, and maddened with the twofold excitement of exercise and liquor, they leaped unhesitatingly down within the enclosure, and holding on their drunken course with shouts and yellings, were soon bewildered in its noisome and intricate recesses. Had they not indeed been intoxicated beyond moral sense, their reeling footsteps must have been palsied by the horrors of their situation. The air was cold and misty. The paving stones, loosened from their beds, lay in wild disorder amid the tall, rank grass which sprang up around the feet and ankles. Fallen houses choked up the streets. The most fetid and poisonous smells everywhere prevailed. And by the aid of that ghastly light which, even at midnight, never fails to emanate from a vapory and pestilential atmosphere, might be discerned lying in the bypaths and alleys, or rotting in the windowless habitations, the carcass of many a nocturnal plunderer, arrested by the hand of the plague in the very perpetration of his robbery. But it lay not in the power of images or sensations or impediments such as these to stay the course of men who, naturally brave, and that time especially brimful of courage and of humming stuff, would have reeled, as straight as their condition might have permitted, undauntedly into the very jaws of death. Onward, still onward stalked the grim Legs, making the desolate solemnity echo and re-echo with yells like the terrific war whoop of the Indian. And onward, still onward rolled the dumpy Tarpaulin, hanging on to the doublet of his more active companion, and far surpassing the latter's most strenuous exertions in the way of vocal music, by bull-roarings in basso from the profundity of his stentorian lungs. They had now evidently reached the stronghold of the pestilence. Their way at every step or plunge grew more noisome and more horrible, the paths more narrow and more intricate. Huge stones and beams falling momently from the decaying roofs about them gave evidence, by their sullen and heavy descent, of the vast height of the surrounding houses, and while actual exertion became necessary to force a passage through frequent heaps of rubbish, it was by no means seldom that the hand fell upon a skeleton, or rested upon a mere fleshly corpse. Suddenly, as the seamen stumbled against the entrance of a tall and ghastly-looking building, a yell, more than usually shrill from the throat of the excited Legs, was replied to from within, in a rapid succession of wild, laughter-like, and fiendish shrieks. Nothing daunted at sounds which, of such a nature, at such a time, and in such a place, might have curdled the very blood in hearts less irrevocably on fire, the drunken couple rushed headlong against the door, burst it open, and staggered into the midst of things with a volley of curses. The room within which they found themselves proved to be the shop of an undertaker, but an open trapdoor in a corner of the floor near the entrance looked down upon a long range of wine cellars, whose depths the occasional sound of bursting bottles proclaimed to be well stored with their appropriate contents. In the middle of the room stood a table, in the centre of which various wines and cordials, together with jugs, pitchers, and flagons of every shape and quality, were scattered profusely upon the board. Around it, upon coffin trestles, was seated a company of 6. This company I will endeavour to delineate one by one. Fronting the entrance, and elevated a little above his companions, sat a personage who appeared to be the president of the table. His stature was gaunt and tall, and Legs was confounded to behold in him a figure more emaciated than himself. His face was as yellow as saffron, but no feature excepting one alone was sufficiently marked to merit a particular description. This one consisted in a forehead so unusually and hideously lofty as to have the appearance of a bonnet or crown of flesh superadded upon the natural head. His mouth was puckered and dimpled into an expression of ghastly affability, and his eyes, as indeed the eyes of all at table, were glazed over with the fumes of intoxication. This gentleman was clothed from head to foot in a richly embroidered black silk velvet pall, wrapped negligently around his form after the fashion of a Spanish cloak. His head was stuck full of sable hearse plumes, which he nodded to and fro with a jaunty and knowing air. And in his right hand he held a huge human thigh bone, with which he appeared to have been just knocking down some member of the company for a song. Opposite him, and with her back to the door, was a lady of no whit the less extraordinary character. Although quite as tall as the person just described, she had no right to complain of his unnatural emaciation. She was evidently in the last stage of a dropsy, and her figure resembled nearly that of the huge puncheon of October beer, which stood, with the head driven in, close by her side, in a corner of the chamber. Her face was exceedingly round, red and full, and the same peculiarity, or rather want of peculiarity, attached itself to her countenance, which I before mentioned in the case of the president. That is to say, only one feature of her face was sufficiently distinguished to need a separate characterization. Indeed, the acute tarpaulin immediately observed that the same remark might have applied to each individual person of the party, every one of whom seemed to possess a monopoly of some particular portion of physiognomy. With the lady in question, this portion proved to be the mouth, commencing at the right ear. It swept with a terrific chasm to the left. The short pendants which she wore in either auricle continually bobbing into the aperture. She made, however, every exertion to keep her mouth closed and look dignified, in a dress consisting of a newly starched and ironed shroud coming up close under her chin, with a crimpled ruffle of cambric muslin. At her right hand sat a diminutive young lady whom she appeared to patronize. This delicate little creature, in the trembling of her wasted fingers, in the livid hue of her lips, and in the slight hectic spot which tinged her otherwise leaden complexion, gave evident indications of a galloping consumption. An air of extreme haut ton, however, pervaded her whole appearance. She wore in a graceful and dégage manner a large and beautiful winding sheet of the finest India lawn. Her hair hung in ringlets over her neck. A soft smile played about her mouth, but her nose, extremely long, thin, sinuous, flexible, and pimpled, hung down far below her under lip, and in spite of the delicate manner in which she now and then moved it to one side or the other with her tongue, gave to her countenance a somewhat equivocal expression. Over against her, and upon the left of the dropsical lady, was seated a little puffy, wheezing, and gouty old man, whose cheeks reposed upon the shoulders of their owner like two huge bladders of Oporto wine. With his arms folded, and with one bandaged leg deposited upon the table, he seemed to think himself entitled to some consideration. He evidently prided himself much upon every inch of his personal appearance, but took more especial delight in calling attention to his gaudy-coloured surtout. This, to say the truth, must have cost him no little money, and was made to fit him exceedingly well, being fashioned from one of the curiously embroidered silken covers appertaining to those glorious escutcheons which, in England and elsewhere, are customarily hung up in some conspicuous place upon the dwellings of departed aristocracy. Next to him, and at the right hand of the president, was a gentleman in long white hose and cotton drawers. His frame shook in a ridiculous manner with a fit of what Tarpaulin called the horrors. His jaws, which had been newly shaved, were tightly tied up by a bandage of muslin, and his arms, being fastened in a similar way at the wrists, prevented him from helping himself too freely to the liquors upon the table, a precaution rendered necessary, in the opinion of Legs, by the peculiarly sottish and wine-bibbing cast of his visage. A pair of prodigious ears, nevertheless, which it was no doubt found impossible to confine, towered away into the atmosphere of the apartment, and were occasionally pricked up in a spasm at the sound of the drawing of a cork. Fronting him, sixthly and lastly, was situated a singularly stiff-looking personage who, being afflicted with paralysis, must, to speak seriously, have felt very ill at ease in unaccommodating habiliments. He was habited, somewhat uniquely, in a new and handsome mahogany coffin, its top or headpiece pressed upon the skull of the wearer and extended over it in the fashion of a hood, giving to the entire face an air of indescribable interest. Armholes had been cut in the sides for the sake not more of elegance than of convenience, but the dress, nevertheless, prevented his proprietor from sitting as erect as his associates, and as he lay reclining against his trestle at an angle of 45 degrees, a pair of huge, goggle eyes rolled up their awful whites towards the ceiling in absolute amazement at their own enormity. Before each of the party lay a portion of a skull, which was used as a drinking cup. Overhead was suspended a human skeleton by means of a rope tied round one of the legs and fastened to a ring in the ceiling. The other limb, confined by no such fetter, stuck off from the body at right angles, causing the whole loose and rattling frame to dangle and twirl about at the caprice of every occasional puff of wind which found its way into the apartment. In the cranium of this hideous thing lay quantity of ignited charcoal, which threw a fitful but vivid light over the entire scene, while coffins and other wares appertaining to the shop of an undertaker were piled high up around the room and against the windows, preventing any ray from escaping into the street. At sight of this extraordinary assembly, and of their still more extraordinary paraphernalia, our two seamen did not conduct themselves with that degree of decorum which might have been expected. Legs, leaning against the wall near which he happened to be standing, dropped his lower jaw still lower than usual, and spread open his eyes to their fullest extent, while Hugh Tarpaulin, stooping down so as to bring his nose upon a level with the table, and spreading out a palm upon either knee, burst into a long, loud, and obstreperous roar of very ill-timed and immoderate laughter. Without, however, taking offence at behaviour so excessively rude, the tall president smiled very graciously upon the intruders, nodded to them in a dignified manner with his head of sable plumes, and, arising, took each by an arm and led him to a seat which some others of the company had placed in the meantime for his accommodation. Legs to all this offered not the slightest resistance, but sat down as he was directed, while the gallant Hugh, removing his coffin trestle from its station near the head of the table, to the vicinity of the little consumptive lady in the winding sheet, plumped down upon her side in high glee, and pouring out a scull of red wine, quaffed it to their better acquaintance. But at this presumption the stiff gentleman in the coffin seemed exceedingly nettled, and serious consequences might have ensued, had not the president, rapping upon the table with his truncheon, diverted the attention of all present to the following speech. "It becomes our duty, upon the present happy occasion—" "Avast there," interrupted Legs, looking very serious. "Avast there a bit, I say, and tell us who the devil ye all are, and what business ye have here, rigged off like the foul fiends and swilling the snug blue ruin stowed away for the winter by my honest shipmate, Will Wemble, the undertaker." At this unpardonable piece of ill-breeding, all the original company half started to their feet, and uttered the same rapid successions of wild fiendish shrieks which had before caught the attention of the seaman. The president, however, was the first to recover his composure, and at length turning to Legs with great dignity recommended, "Most willingly. We will gratify any reasonable curiosity on the part of guests so illustrious, unbidden though they be. Know then that in these dominions I am monarch, and here rule with undivided empire under the title of King Pest the First. This apartment, which you no doubt profoundly suppose to be the shop of Will Wimble the Undertaker, a man whom we know not, and whose plebeian appellation has been before this night thwarted our royal ears. This apartment, I say, is the de chambre of our palace, devoted to the councils of our kingdom and to other sacred and lofty purposes. The noble lady who sits opposite is Queen Pest, our serene consort. The other exalted personages whom you behold are all of our family, and wear the insignia of the blood royal under the respective titles of His Grace the Archduke Pestiferous, His Grace the Duke Pest Elentia, His Grace the Duke Tempest, and Her Serene Highness the Archduchess of Anna Pest. As regards," continued he, "your demand of the business upon which we sit here in council, we might be pardoned for replying that it concerns and concerns alone our own private and regal interest, and is in no manner important to any other than ourselves. But in consideration of those rights to which as guests and strangers you may feel yourselves entitled, we will furthermore explain that we are here this night, prepared by deep research and accurate investigation, to examine, analyze, and thoroughly determine the indefinable spirit, the incomprehensible qualities and nature of those inestimable treasures of the palate, the wines, ales, and liqueurs of this goodly metropolis, by so doing to advance not more our own designs than the true welfare of that unearthly sovereign whose reign is over us all, whose dominions are unlimited, and whose name is Death." "Whose name is Davy Jones?" ejaculated Tarpaulin, helping the lady by his side to a scull of liqueur, and pouring out a second for himself. "Profane varlet," said the president, now turning his attention to the worthy Hugh. "Profane and execrable wretch, we have said that in consideration of those rights which, even in thy filthy person, we feel no inclination to violate, we have condescended to make reply to thy rude and unseasonable inquiries. We nevertheless, for your unhallowed intrusion upon our counsels, believe it our duty to mulct thee and thy companion in each a gallon of blackstrap, having imbibed which to the prosperity of our kingdom at a single draught, and upon your bended knees ye shall be forthwith free either to proceed upon your way, or remain and be admitted to the privileges of our table, according to your respective and individual pleasures."
"It would be a matter of utter impossibility,"
replied Legs, whom the assumptions and dignity of King Pest the First had evidently inspired some feelings of respect, and who arose and steadied himself by the table as he spoke.
"It would, please your majesty, be a matter of utter impossibility to stow away in my hold even 1/4 part of the same liquor which your majesty has just mentioned, to say nothing of the stuffs placed on board in the forenoon by way of ballast, and not to mention the various ales and liqueurs shipped this evening at different seaports. I have at present a full cargo of humming stuff, taken in and duly paid for, at the sign of the Jolly Tar. You will, therefore, please your majesty, be so good as to take the will for the deed." For by no manner of means neither can I or will I swallow another drop, least of all a drop of the villainous bilge water that answers to the name of Black Strap."
"Belay that," interrupted Tarpaulin, astonished not more at the length of his companion's speech than at the nature of his refusal. "Belay that, you lubber, and I say, legs none of your palaver. My hull is still light, although I confess you yourself seem to be a little top-heavy. And as for the matter of your share of the cargo, why, rather than raise a squall, I would find stowage room for it myself. But this proceeding," interposed the President, "is by no means in accordance with the terms of the mulct or sentence, which is in its nature median, and not to be altered or recalled. The conditions we have imposed must be fulfilled to the letter, and that without a moment's hesitation. In failure of which fulfillment we decree that you do here be tied neck and heels together, and duly drowned as rebels in yon hogshead of October beer."
A sentence! A sentence! A righteous and just sentence! A glorious decree! A most worthy and upright and holy condemnation!
shouted the Pest family altogether. The king elevated his forehead into innumerable wrinkles. The gouty little old man puffed like a pair of bellows. The lady of the winding sheet waved her nose to and fro. The gentleman in the cotton drawers picked up his ears. She of the shroud gasped like a dying fish, and he of the coffin looked stiff and rolled up his eyes. "Ha ha ha!" chuckled Tarpaulin, without heeding the general excitation. "Ha ha ha! I was saying," said he, "I was saying when Mr. King Pest poked in his maul and spike, that as for the matter of 2 or 3 gallons more or less of black strap, it was a trifle to a tight sea-boat like myself not overstowed, but when it comes to drinking the health of the devil whom God assoily, and going down upon my marrow bones to his ill-favoured majesty there, whom I know as well as I know myself to be a sinner, to be nobody in the whole world but Tim Hurly-Gurly the stage player, why, it's quite another guess sort of a thing, and utterly and altogether past my comprehension." He was not allowed to finish this speech in tranquillity. At the name Tim Hurly-Gurly, the whole assembly leaped from their named seats. "Treason!" shouted His Majesty King Pest the First.
"Treason!"
said the little man with the gout. "Treason!" screamed the Archduchess Anna Pest. "Treason!" muttered the gentleman with his jaws tied up. "Treason!" growled he of the coffin. "Treason! Treason!" shrieked Her Majesty of the Mouth, and seized by the hinder part of his breeches the unfortunate Tarpaulin, who had just commenced pouring out for himself a scull of liqueur, she lifted him high into the air and let him fall without ceremony into the huge open puncheon of his beloved ale. Bobbing up and down for a few seconds like an apple in a bowl of toddy, he at length fully disappeared amid the whirlpool of foam which in the already effervescent liquor his struggles easily succeeded in creating. Not tamely, however, did the tall seaman behold the discomfiture of his companion. Jostling King Pest through the open trap, the valiant legs slammed the door down upon him with an oath, and strode towards the centre of the room. Here, tearing down the skeleton which swung over the table, he laid it about him with so much energy and goodwill that, as the last glimpses of light died away within the apartment, he succeeded in knocking out the brains of the little gentleman with the gout. Rushing then with all his force against the fatal hogshead full of October ale and Hugh Tarpaulin, he rolled it over and over in an instant. Out burst a deluge of liquor, so fierce, so impetuous, so overwhelming that the room was flooded from wall to wall. The loaded table was overturned, the trestles were thrown upon their backs, the tub of punch into the fireplace, and the ladies into hysterics. Piles of death furniture floundered about. Jugs, pitchers, and carboys mingled promiscuously in the melee, and wicker flagons encountered desperately with bottles of junk. The man with the horrors was drowned upon the spot. The little stiff gentleman floated off in his coffin, and the victorious legs, seizing by the waist the fat lady in the shroud, rushed out with her into the street and made a beeline for the free and easy, followed under easy sail by the redoubtable Hugh Tarpaulin, who, having sneezed 3 or 4 times, panted and puffed after him with the Archduchess Anna Pest. Well, what do you think of that one? You've just heard King Pest by Edgar Allan Poe. Grotesque, unsettling, and darkly funny, in a way only Poe could write. The sailor who first told me this story swore the old plague quarter still exists. He didn't know exactly where, only that certain alleys appear when a man has had too much to drink, and vanish again by morning. I never tried to find it, because some gatherings are best left alone. Even tonight, as I sit here recounting this tale to you, I can't shake the feeling that I'm being followed. Footsteps linger just beyond the lamplight. I don't know if you've heard them. Shuffling shadows that move when I turn my head. Anyway, if you enjoyed tonight's journey into the strange and the macabre, make sure to tune in again the next time, where the shadows of classic horror lurk and creep. And remember, some feasts were never meant for the living. Good night. This has been King Pest, written by Edgar Allan Poe, narrated for you by Jonathan Dunne. Original year of publication 1835. This work is in the public domain. Production and narration copyright 2026, Jonathan Dunne. The Moonlit Road, written by Ambrose Bierce. Original year of publication 1907. This work is in the public domain. Production and narration copyright 2025, Jonathan Dunne. One. Statement of Joel Hetman, Jr. I am the most unfortunate of men, rich, respected, fairly well educated, and of sound health, with many other advantages usually valued by those having them and coveted by those who have them not. I sometimes think that I should be less unhappy if they had been denied me, for then the contrast between my outer and my inner life would not be continually demanding a painful attention. In the stress of privation and the need of effort, I might sometimes forget the sombre secret ever baffling the conjecture that it compels. I am the only child of Joel and Julia Hetman. The one was a well-to-do country gentleman, the other a beautiful and accomplished woman to whom he was passionately attached with what I now know to have been a jealous and exacting devotion. The family home was a few miles from Nashville, Tennessee, a large, irregular-built dwelling of no particular order of architecture, a little way off the road in a park of trees and shrubbery. At the time of which I write, I was 19 years old, a student at Yale. One day I received a telegram from my father of such urgency that in compliance with its unexplained demand I left at once for home. At the railway station in Nashville a distant relative awaited me to apprise me of the reason for my recall. My mother had been barbarously murdered. Why and by whom none could conjecture, but the circumstances were there. My father had gone to Nashville, intending to return the next afternoon. Something prevented his accomplishing the business in hand, so he returned on the same night, arriving just before dawn. In his testimony before the coroner, he explained that having no latchkey, and not caring to disturb the sleeping servants, he had, with no clearly defined intention, gone round to the rear of the house. As he turned an angle of the building, he heard a sound as of a door gently closed, and saw in the darkness indistinctly the figure of a man, which instantly disappeared among the trees of the lawn. A hasty pursuit and brief search of the grounds in the belief that the trespasser was someone secretly visiting a servant proving fruitless. He entered at the unlocked door and mounted the stairs to my mother's chamber. Its door was open, and stepping into the black darkness, he fell headlong over some heavy object on the floor. I may spare myself the details. It was my poor mother, dead of strangulation by human hands. Nothing had been taken from the house. The servants had heard no sound, and, excepting those terrible finger marks upon the dead woman's throat, dear God, that I might forget them, no trace of the assassin was ever found. I gave up my studies and remained with my father, who naturally was greatly changed. Always of a sedate, taciturn disposition, he now fell into so deep a dejection that nothing could hold his attention. Yet anything, a footfall, the sudden closing of a door, aroused in him a fitful interest. One might have called it an apprehension. At any small surprise of the senses he would start visibly and sometimes turn pale, then relapse into a melancholy apathy deeper than before. I suppose he was what is called a nervous wreck. As to me, I was younger then than now. There is much in that. Youth is Gilead, in which is balm for every wound. Ah, that I might again dwell in that enchanted land, unacquainted with grief. I knew not how to appraise my bereavement. I could not rightly estimate the strength of the stroke. One night, a few months after the dreadful event, my father and I walked home from the city. The full moon was about 3 hours above the eastern horizon. The entire countryside had the solemn stillness of a summer night. Our footfalls and the ceaseless song of the katydids were the only sound aloof. Black shadows of bordering trees lay athwart the road, which, in the short reaches between, gleamed a ghostly white. As we approached the gate to our dwelling, whose front was in shadow, and in which no light shone, my father suddenly stopped and clutched my arm, saying, hardly above his breath, God, what is that?" "I hear nothing," I replied. "But see, he said, pointing along the road directly ahead. I said, "Nothing is there. Come, father, let us go in. You are ill." He had released my arm and was standing rigid and motionless in the centre of the illuminated roadway, staring like one bereft of sense. His face in the moonlight showed a pallor and fixity inexpressibly distressing. I pulled gently at his sleeve, but he had forgotten my existence. Presently he began to retire backward, step by step, never for an instant removing his eyes from what he saw, or thought he saw. I turned half round to follow, but stood irresolute. I do not recall any feeling of fear, unless a sudden chill was its physical manifestation. It seemed as if an icy wind had touched my face, and enfolded my body from head to foot. I could feel the stir of it in my hair. At that moment, my attention was drawn to a light that suddenly streamed from an upper window of the house. One of the servants, awakened by what mysterious premonition of evil who can say, and in obedience to an impulse that she was never able to name, had lit a lamp. When I turned to look for my father, he was gone. And in all the years that have passed, no whisper of his fate has come across the borderland of conjecture from the realm of the unknown. 2. Statement of Caspar Grattan. Today I am said to live. Tomorrow, here in this room, will lie a senseless shape of clay that all too long was I. If anyone lift the cloth from the face of that unpleasant thing, it will be in gratification of a mere morbid curiosity. Some, doubtless, will go further and inquire, who was he? In this writing I supply the only answer that I am able to make. Caspar Grattan. Surely that should be enough. The name has served my small need for more than 20 years of a life of unknown length. True, I give it to myself, but lacking another I had the right. In this world one must have a name. It prevents confusion, even when it does not establish identity. Some, though, are known by numbers which also seem inadequate distinctions. One day, for illustration, I was passing along a street of a city, far from here, when I met 2 men in uniform, one of whom, half pausing and looking curiously into my face, said to his companion, "That man looks like 767. Something in the number seemed familiar and horrible. Moved by an uncontrollable impulse, I sprang into a side street and ran until I fell exhausted in a country lane. I have never forgotten that number, and always it comes to memory attended by gibbering obscenity, peals of joyless laughter, the clang of iron doors. So I say my name, even if self-bestowed, is better than a number. In the register of the potter's field I shall soon have both. What wealth! Of him who shall find this paper I must beg a little consideration. It is not the history of my life, the knowledge to write, that is denied me. This is only a record of broken and apparently unrelated memories, some of them as distinct and sequent as brilliant beads upon a thread, others remote and strange, having the character of crimson dreams with interspaces blank and black, witch-fires glowing still and red in a great desolation. Standing upon the shore of eternity, I turn for a last look landward over the course by which I came. There are 20 years of footprints fairly distinct, the impressions of bleeding feet. They lead through poverty and pain, devious and unsure, as of one staggering beneath a burden. Remote, unfriended, melancholy, slow. Ah, the poet's prophecy of me, how admirable, how dreadfully admirable! Backward beyond the beginning of this Via Dolorosa, this epic of suffering with episodes of sin, I see nothing clearly. It comes out of a cloud. I know that it spans only 20 years, yet I am an old man. One does not remember one's birth, one has to be told. But with me it was different. Life came to me full-handed and dowered me with all my faculties and powers. Of a previous existence I know no more than others, for all have stammering intimations that may be memories and may be dreams. I know only that my first consciousness was of maturity in body and mind, a consciousness accepted without surprise or conjecture. I merely found myself waking in a forest, half-clad, footsore, unutterably weary and hungry. Seeing a farmhouse, I approached and asked for food, which was given me by one who inquired my name. I did not know, yet knew that all had names. Greatly embarrassed, I retreated, and night coming on, lay down in the forest and slept. The next day I entered the large town which I shall not name, nor shall I recount further incidents of the life that is now to end, a life of wandering, always and everywhere haunted by an overmastering sense of crime in punishment of wrong, and of terror in punishment of crime. Let me see if I can reduce it to narrative. I seem once to have lived near a great city, a prosperous planter, married to a woman whom I loved and distrusted. We had, it sometimes seems, one child, a youth of brilliant parts and promise. He is at all times a vague figure, never clearly drawn, frequently altogether out of the picture. One luckless evening it occurred to me to test my wife's fidelity in a vulgar, commonplace way familiar to everyone who has acquaintance with the literature of fact and fiction. I went to the city, telling my wife that I should be absent until the following afternoon, but I returned before daybreak, and went to the rear of the house, purposing to enter by a door with which I had secretly so tampered that it would seem to lock, yet not actually fasten. As I approached it, I heard it gently open and close, and saw a man steal away into the darkness. With murder in my heart, I sprang after him, but he had vanished without even the bad luck of identification. Sometimes now I cannot even persuade myself that it was a human being. Crazed with jealousy and rage, blind and bestial with all the elemental passions of insulted manhood, I entered the house and sprang up the stairs to the door of my wife's chamber. It was closed, but having tampered with its lock also, I easily entered, and despite the black darkness, soon stood by the side of her bed. My groping hands told me that although disarranged, it was unoccupied. She is below, I thought, and, terrified by my entrance, has evaded me in the darkness of the hall. With the purpose of seeking her, I turned to leave the room, but took a wrong direction, the right one. My foot struck her, cowering in a corner of the room. Instantly my hands were at her throat. Stifling a shriek, my knees were upon her struggling body, and there in the darkness, without a word of accusation or reproach, I strangled her till she died. There ends the dream. I have related it in the past tense, but the present would be the fitter form, for again and again the sombre tragedy reenacts itself in my consciousness. Over and over I laid the plan, I suffered the confirmation. I redressed the wrong. Then all is blank. And afterward the rains beat against the grimy window panes, or the snows fall upon my scant attire. The wheels rattle in the squalid streets where my life lies in poverty and mean employment. If there is ever sunshine, I do not recall it. If there are birds, they do not sing. There is another dream, another vision of the night. I stand among the shadows in a moonlit road. I am aware of another presence, but whose I cannot rightly determine. In the shadow of a great dwelling I catch the gleam of white garments. Then the figure of a woman confronts me in the road. My murdered wife! There is death in the face. There are marks upon the throat. The eyes are fixed on mine with an infinite gravity which is not reproach, nor hate, nor menace, nor anything less terrible than recognition. Before this awful apparition I retreat in terror, a terror that is upon me as I write. I can no longer rightly shape the words. See, they... Now I am calm. But truly there is no more to tell. The incident ends where it began, in darkness and in doubt. Yes, I am again in control of myself, the captain of my soul. But that is not respite. It is another stage and phase of expiation. My penance, constant in degree, is mutable in kind. One of its variants is tranquility. After all, it is only a life sentence. To hell for life! That is a foolish penalty. The culprit chooses the duration of his punishment. Today, my term expires. To each and all, the peace that was not mine. 3 3. Statement of the late Julia Hetman through the medium bay rolls. I had retired early and fallen almost immediately into a peaceful sleep, from which I awoke with that indefinable sense of peril, which is, I think, a common experience in that other, earlier life. Of its unmeaning character, too, I was entirely persuaded, yet that did not banish it. My husband, Joel Hetman, was away from home. The servants slept in another part of the house, but these were familiar conditions. They had never before distressed me. Nevertheless, the strange terror grew so insupportable that, conquering my reluctance to move, I sat up and lit the lamp at my bedside. Contrary to my expectation, this gave me no relief. The light seemed rather an added danger, for I reflected that it would shine out under the door, disclosing my presence to whatever evil thing might lurk outside. You that are still in the flesh, subject to horrors of the imagination, think of what a monstrous fear that must be which seeks in darkness security from malevolent existences of the night. That is to spring to close quarters with an unseen enemy, the strategy of despair. Extinguishing the lamp, I pulled the bed-clothing about my head and lay trembling and silent, unable to shriek, forgetful to pray. In this pitiable state I must have lain for what you call hours. With us there are no hours. There is no time. At last it came, a soft, irregular sound of footfalls on the stairs. They were slow, hesitant, uncertain, as if something that did not see its way, to my disordered reason all the more terrifying, for that, as the approach of some blind and mindless malevolence to which is no appeal. I even thought that I must have left the hall lamp burning, and the groping of this creature proved it a monster of the night. This was foolish and inconsistent with my previous dread of the light. But what would you have? Fear has no brains. It is an idiot. The dismal witness that it bears and the cowardly counsel that it whispers are unrelated. We know this well, we who have passed into the realm of terror, who skulk in eternal dusk among these scenes of our former lives, invisible even to ourselves and one another, yet hiding forlorn in lonely places, yearning for speech with our loved ones, yet dumb and as fearful of them as they of us. Sometimes the disability is removed, the law suspended. By the deathless power of love or hate, we break the spell. We are seen by those whom we would warn, console, or punish. What form we see to them to bear we know not. We know only that we terrify, even those whom we most wish to comfort, and from whom we must crave tenderness and sympathy. Forgive, I pray you, this inconsequent digression of what was once a woman. Who you consult us in this perfect way, you do not understand. You ask foolish questions about things unknown and things forbidden. Much that we know and could impart in our speech is meaningless in yours. We must communicate with you through a stammering intelligence in that small fraction of our language that you yourselves can speak. You think that we are of another world. No, we have knowledge of no world but yours, though for us it holds no sunlight, no warmth, no music, no laughter, no song of birds, nor any companionship. Oh God, what a thing it is to be a ghost, cowering and shivering in an altered world, a prey to apprehension and despair. No, I did not die of fright. The thing turned and went away. I heard it go down the stairs, hurriedly, I thought, as if itself in sudden fear. Then I rose to call for help. Hardly had my shaking hand found the doorknob when Merciful heaven! I heard it returning. His footfalls as it remounted the stairs were rapid, heavy and loud. They shook the house. I fled to an angle of the wall and crouched upon the floor. I tried to pray. I tried to call the name of my dear husband. Then I heard the door thrown open. There was an interval of unconsciousness, and when I revived I felt a strangling clutch upon my throat, felt my arms feebly beating against something that bore me backward, felt my tongue thrusting itself from between my teeth. And then I passed into this life. No, I have no knowledge of what it was. The sum of what we knew at death is the measure of what we know afterward of all that went before. Of this existence we know many things, but no new light falls upon any page of that. In memory is written all of it that we can read. Here are no heights of truth overlooking the confused landscape of that dubitable domain. We still dwell in the valley of the shadow, lurk in its desolate places, peering from brambles and thickets at its mad, malign inhabitants. How should we have new knowledge of that fading past? What I am about to relate happened on a night. We know when it is night, for then you retire to your houses, and we can venture from our places of concealment to move unafraid about our old homes, to look in at the windows, even to enter and gaze upon your faces as you sleep. I had lingered long near the dwelling where I had been so cruelly changed to what I am, as we do while any that we love or hate remain. Vainly I had sought some method of manifestation, some way to make my continued existence and my great love and poignant pity understood by my husband and son. Always, if they slept, they would wake, or if in my desperation I dared approach them when they were awake, would turn toward me the terrible eyes of the living, frightening me by the glances that I sought from the purpose that I held. On this night I searched for them without success, fearing to find them. They were nowhere in the house, nor about the moonlit lawn. For although the sun is lost to us forever, the moon, full-orbed or slender, remains to us. Sometimes it shines by night, sometimes by day, but always it rises and sets, as in that other life. I left the lawn and moved in the white light and silence along the road, aimless and sorrowing. Suddenly, I heard the voice of my poor husband in exclamations of astonishment, with that of my son in reassurance and dissuasion. And there by the shadow of a group of trees they stood, near, so near. Their faces were toward me, the eyes of the elder man fixed upon mine. He saw me. At last he saw me. In the consciousness of that, my terror fled as a cruel dream. The death spell was broken. Love had conquered law. Mad with exultation, I shouted. I must have shouted. He sees, he will understand. Then, controlling myself, I moved forward, smiling and consciously beautiful, to offer myself to his arms, to comfort him with endearments, and, with my son's hand in mine, to speak words that should restore the broken bonds between the living and the dead. Alas, alas! His face went white with fear. His eyes were as those of a hunted animal. He backed away from me as I advanced, and at last turned and fled into the wood, whither it is not given to me to know. To my poor boy, left doubly desolate, I have never been able to impart a sense of my presence. Soon he too must pass to this life invisible, and be lost to me forever. This has been The Moonlit Road, written by Ambrose Bierce. Original year of publication, 1907. This work is in the public domain. Production and narration copyright 2025. Jonathan Dunne. An Occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge by Ambrose Bierce. Year of publication, 1891. This work is in the public domain. Production and narration copyright, 2025. Jonathan Dunne. A man stood upon a railroad bridge in northern Alabama, looking down into the swift water 20 feet below. The man's hands were behind his back, the wrists bound with a cord. A rope closely encircled his neck. It was attached to a stout cross-timber above his head, and the slack fell to the level of his knees. Some loose boards, laid upon the tie supporting the rails of the railway, supplied a footing for him and his executioners. 2 private soldiers of the Federal Army, directed by a sergeant who, in civil life, may have been a deputy sheriff. At a short remove upon the same temporary platform was an officer in the uniform of his rank, armed. He was a captain. A sentinel at each end of the bridge stood with his rifle in the position known as support, that is to say, vertical, in front of the left shoulder, the hammer resting on the forearm thrown straight across the chest, a formal and unnatural position, enforcing an erect carriage of the body. It did not appear to be the duty of these men to know what was occurring at the centre of the bridge. They merely blockaded the 2 ends of the foot planking that traversed it. Beyond one of the sentinels nobody was in sight. The railroad ran straight away into a forest for 100 yards, then, curving, was lost to view. Doubtless there was an outpost further along. The outer bank of the stream was open ground, a gentle slope topped with a stockade of vertical tree trunks, loopholed for rifles, with a single embrasure through which protruded the muzzle of a brass cannon commanding the bridge. Midway up the slope between the bridge and fort were the spectators, a single company of infantry in line, at parade rest, the butts of their rifles on the ground, the barrels inclining slightly backward against the right shoulder, the hands crossed upon the stock. A lieutenant stood at the right of the line, the point of his sword upon the ground, his left hand resting upon his right. Excepting the group of 4 at the centre of the bridge, not a man moved. The company faced the bridge, staring stonily, motionless. The sentinels facing the banks of the stream might have been statues to adorn the bridge. The captain stood with folded arms, silent, observing the work of his subordinates, but making no sign. Death is a dignitary who, when he comes announced, is to be received with formal manifestations of respect, even by those most familiar with him. In the code of military etiquette, silence and fixity are forms of deference. The man who was engaged in being hanged was apparently about 35 years of age. He was a civilian, if one might judge from his habit, which was that of a planter. His features were good, a straight nose, firm mouth, broad forehead, from which his long dark hair was combed straight back, falling behind his ears to the collar of his well-fitting frock coat. He wore a moustache and pointed beard, but no whiskers. His eyes were large and dark grey, and had a kindly expression, which one would hardly have expected in one whose neck was in the hemp. Evidently this was no vulgar assassin. The liberal military code makes provision for hanging many kinds of persons, and gentlemen are not excluded. The preparations being complete, the 2 private soldiers stepped aside, and each drew away the plank upon which he had been standing. The sergeant turned to the captain, saluted, and placed himself immediately behind the officer, who in turn moved apart 1 pace. These movements left the condemned man and the sergeant standing on the 2 ends of the same plank, which spanned 3 of the cross ties of the bridge. The end upon which the civilian stood almost, but not quite, reached a fourth. This plank had been held in place by the weight of the captain. It was now held by that of the sergeant. At a signal from the former, the latter would step aside. The plank would tilt and the condemned man would go down between two ties. The arrangement commended itself to his judgment as simple and effective. His face had not been covered nor his eyes bandaged. He looked a moment at his unsteadfast footing, then let his gaze wander to the swirling water of the stream racing madly beneath his feet. A piece of dancing driftwood caught his attention, and his eyes followed it down the current. How slowly it appeared to move. What a sluggish stream. He closed his eyes in order to fix his last thoughts upon his wife and children. The water, touched to gold by the early sun, the brooding mists under the banks at some distance down the stream, the fort, the soldiers, the piece of drift, all had distracted him, and now he became conscious of a new disturbance. Striking through the thought of his dear ones was sound, which he could neither ignore nor understand, a sharp, distinct metallic percussion like the stroke of a blacksmith's hammer upon the anvil. It had the same ringing quality. He wondered what it was, and whether immeasurably distant or nearby. It seemed both. Its recurrence was regular, but as slow as the tolling of a death knell. He awaited each new stroke with impatience, and, he knew not why, apprehension. The intervals of silence grew progressively longer. The delays became maddening. With their greater infrequency, the sounds increased in strength and sharpness. They hurt his ear like the thrust of a knife. He feared he would shriek. What he heard was the ticking of his watch. He unclosed his eyes and saw again the water below him. If I could free my hands, he thought, I might throw off the noose and spring into the stream. By diving I could evade the bullets and, swimming vigorously, reach the bank, take to the woods, and get away home. My home, thank God, is as yet outside their lines. My wife and little ones are still beyond the invaders' farthest advance. As these thoughts, which have here to be set down in words, were flashed into the doomed man's brain rather than evolved from it, the captain nodded to the sergeant. The sergeant stepped aside. 2. Peyton Farquhar was a well-to-do planter of an old and highly respected Alabama family. Being a slave owner and, like other slave owners, a politician, he was naturally an original cessationist and ardently devoted to the Southern cause. Circumstances of an imperious nature, which it is unnecessarily to relate here, had prevented him from taking service with that gallant army which had fought the disastrous campaigns ending with the fall of Corinth. And he chafed under the inglorious restraint, longing for the release of his energies, the larger life of the soldier, the opportunity for distinction. That opportunity he felt would come, as it comes to all in wartime. Meanwhile he did what he could. No service was too humble for him to perform in the aid of the South, no adventure too perilous for him to undertake, if consistent with the character of a civilian who was at heart a soldier, and who in good faith and without too much qualification assented to at least a part of the frankly villainous dictum that all is fair in love and war. One evening, while Farquhar and his wife were sitting on a rustic bench near the entrance to his grounds, a grey-clad soldier rode up to the gate and asked for a drink of water. Mrs. Farquhar was only too happy to serve him with her own white hands. While she was fetching the water, her husband approached the dusty horseman and inquired eagerly for news from the front. "The Yanks are repairing the railroads," said the man, "and are getting ready for another advance. They have reached the Owl Creek Bridge, put it in order, and built a stockade on the north bank. The commandant has issued an order, which is posted everywhere, declaring that any civilian caught interfering with the railroad, its bridges, tunnels, or trains will be summarily hanged. I saw the order." "How far is it to the Owl Creek Bridge?" Farquhar asked. "About 30 miles. Is there no force on this side of the creek?" "Only a picket post half a mile out, on the railroad. and a single sentinel at his end of the bridge. Suppose a man, a civilian and student of hanging, should elude the picket post and perhaps get the better of the sentinel, said Farquhar, smiling. What could he accomplish? The soldier reflected. I was there a month ago, he replied. I observed that the flood of last winter had lodged a great quantity of driftwood against the wooden pier at this end of the bridge. It is now dry and would burn like tinder. The lady had now brought the water, which the soldier drank. He thanked her ceremoniously, bowed to her husband, and rode away. An hour later, after nightfall, he repassed the plantation, going northward in the direction from which he had come. He was a Federal scout? 3. As Peyton Farquhar fell straight downward through the bridge, he lost consciousness, and was as one already dead. From this state he was awakened, ages later, it seemed to him, by the pain of a sharp pressure upon his throat, followed by a sense of suffocation. Keen, poignant agonies seemed to shoot from his neck downward through every fibre of his body and limbs. These pains appeared to flash along well-defined lines of ramification and to beat with an inconceivably rapid periodicity. They seemed like streams of pulsating fire heating him to an intolerable temperature. As to his head, he was conscious of nothing but a feeling of fullness, of congestion. These sensations were accompanied by thought. The intellectual part of his nature was already effaced. He had power only to feel, and feeling was torment. He was conscious of motion, encompassed in a luminous cloud of which he was now merely the fiery heart. Without material substance, he swung through unthinkable arcs of oscillation, like a vast pendulum. Then, all at once, with terrible suddenness, the light about him shot upward, with the noise of a loud splash. A frightful roaring was in his ears, and all was cold and dark. The power of thought was restored. He knew that the rope had broken, and he had fallen into the stream. There was no additional strangulation. The noose about his neck was already suffocating him, and kept the water from his lungs. To die of hanging at the bottom of a river, the idea seemed to him ludicrous. He opened his eyes in the darkness, and saw above him a gleam of light. But how distant, how inaccessible! He was still sinking, for the light became fainter and fainter until it was a mere glimmer. Then it began to grow and brighten, and he knew that he was rising toward the surface, knew it with reluctance, for he was now very comfortable. To be hanged and drowned, he thought. That is not bad, but I do not wish to be shot. No, I will not be shot. That is not fair. He was not conscious of an effort, but a sharp pain in his wrist apprised him that he was trying to free his hands. He gave the struggle his attention, as an idle might observe the feat of a juggler without interest in the outcome. What splendid effort! What magnificent, what superhuman strength! Ah, that was a fine endeavour! Bravo! The cord fell away. His arms parted and floated upward, the hands dimly seen on each side in the growing light. He watched them with a new interest, as first one and then the other pounced upon the noose at his neck. They tore it away and thrust it fiercely aside, its undulations resembling those of a water snake. "Put it back! Put it back!" he thought. He shouted these words to his hands, for the undoing of the noose had been succeeded by the direst pang that he had yet experienced. His neck ached horribly, his brain was on fire, his heart, which had been fluttering faintly, gave a great leap, trying to force itself out of his mouth. His whole body was racked and wrenched with an insupportable anguish, but his disobedient hands gave no heed to the command. They beat the water vigorously with quick downward strokes, forcing him to the surface. He felt his head emerge. His eyes were blinded by the sunlight. His chest expanded convulsively, and with a supreme and crowning agony in his lungs engulfed a great draught of air, which instantly he expelled in a shriek. He was now in full possession of his physical senses. They were indeed preternaturally keen and alert. Something in the awful disturbance of his organic system had so exalted and refined them that they made record of things never before perceived. He felt the ripples upon his face and heard their separate sounds as they struck. He looked at the forest on the bank of the stream, saw the individual trees, the leaves, and the veining of each leaf. He saw the very insects upon them, the locusts, the brilliant-bodied flies, the grey spiders stretching their webs from twig to twig. He noted the prismatic colours in all the dewdrops upon a million blades of grass, the humming of the gnats that danced above the eddies of the stream, the beating of the dragonfly's wings, the strokes of the water spider's legs, like oars which had lifted their boat. All these made audible music. A fish slid along beneath his eyes, and he heard the rush of its body parting the water. He had come to the surface facing down the stream. In a moment the visible world seemed to wheel slowly round, himself the pivotal point, and he saw the bridge, the fort, the soldiers upon the bridge, the captain, the sergeant, the two privates, his executioners. They were in silhouette against the blue sky. They shouted and gesticulated, pointing at him. The captain had drawn his pistol, but did not fire. The others were unarmed. Their movements were grotesque and horrible, their forms gigantic. Suddenly he heard a sharp report, and something struck the water smartly within a few inches of his head, spattering his face with spray. He heard a second report, and saw one of the sentinels with his rifle at his shoulder, a light cloud of blue smoke rising from the muzzle. The man in the water saw the eye of the man on the bridge gazing into his own through the sights of the rifle. He observed that it was a grey eye, and remembered having read that grey eyes were keenest, and that all famous marksmen had them. Nevertheless, this one had missed. A counter-swirl had caught Farquhar and turned him half round. He was again looking at the forest and the bank opposite the fort. The sound of a clear, high voice in a monotonous sing-song now rang out behind him and came across the water with a distinctness that pierced and subdued all other sounds, even the beating of the ripples in his ears. Although no soldier, he had frequented camps enough to know the dread significance of that deliberate, drawling, aspirated chant. The lieutenant on shore was taking a part in the morning's work. How coldly and pitilessly, with what an even, calm intonation, presaging and enforcing tranquillity in the men, with what accurately measured interval fell those cruel words. "Company! Attention! Shoulder arms! Ready? Aim! Fire!" Farquhar dived as deeply as he could. The water roared in his ears like the voice of Niagara, yet he heard the dull thunder of the volley, and rising again towards the surface met shining bits of metal, singularly flattened, oscillating slowly downward. Some of them touched him on the face and hands, then fell away, continuing their descent. One lodged between his collar and neck. It was uncomfortably warm. As he rose to the surface, gasping for breath, he saw that he had been a long time under water. He was perceptibly farther downstream, nearer to safety. The soldiers had almost finished reloading. The metal ramrods flashed all at once in the sunshine as they were drawn from the barrels, turned in the air and thrust into their sockets. The two sentinels fired again, independently and ineffectually. The hunted man saw all this over his shoulder. He was now swimming vigorously with the current. His brain was as energetic as his arms and legs. He thought with the rapidity of lightning. "The officer," he reasoned, "will not make that Martinet's error a second time. It's as easy to dodge a volley as a single shot. He has probably already given the command to fire at will. God help me! I cannot dodge them all." An appalling splash within 2 yards of him was followed by a loud, rushing sound, diminuendo, which seemed to travel back through the air to the fort and died in an explosion which stirred the very river to its deeps. A rising sheet of water curved over him, fell down upon him, blinded him, strangled him. The cannon had taken a hand in the game. As he shook his hand free from the commotion of the smitten water, he heard the deflected shot humming through the air ahead, and in an instant it was cracking and smashing the branches in the forest beyond. "They will not do that again," he thought. The next time they will use a charge of grape. I must keep my eye upon the gun. The smoke will apprise me. The report arrives too late. It lags behind the missile. That is a good gun. Suddenly he felt himself whirled around and around, spinning like a top. The waters, the banks, the forests, the now distant bridge, fort and men, all were commingled and blurred. Objects were represented by their colours. Circular, horizontal streaks of colour. That was all he saw. He had been caught in a vortex, and was being whirled on with a velocity of advance and gyration that made him giddy and sick. In few moments he was flung upon the gravel at the foot of the left bank of the stream, the southern bank, and behind a projecting point which concealed him from his enemies. The sudden arrest of his motion, the abrasion of one of his hands on the gravel, restored him, and he wept with delight. He dug his fingers into the sand, threw it over himself, in handfuls and audibly blessed it. It looked like diamonds, rubies, emeralds. He could think of nothing beautiful which it did not resemble. The trees upon the bank were giant garden plants. He noted a definite order in their arrangement, inhaled the fragrance of their blooms. A strange roseate light shone through the spaces among their trunks, and the wind made in their branches the music of Aeolon's harps. He had not wished to perfect his escape. He was content to remain in that enchanting spot until retaken. A whiz and a rattle of grape shot among the branches high above his head roused him from his dream. The baffled cannoneer had fired him a random farewell. He sprang to his feet, rushed up the sloping bank, and plunged into the forest. All that day he travelled, laying his course by the rounding sun. The forest seemed interminable. Nowhere did he discover a break in it, not even a woodman's road. He had not known that he lived in so wild a region. There was something uncanny in the revelation. By nightfall he was fatigued, footsore, famished. The thought of his wife and children urged him on. At last he found a road which led him in what he knew to be the right direction. It was as dark and straight as a city street, yet it seemed untravelled. No fields bordered it, no dwelling anywhere. Not so much as the barking of a dog suggested human habitation. The black bodies of the trees formed a straight wall on both sides, terminating on the horizon in a point, like a diagram in a lesson in perspective. Overhead, as he looked up through this rift in the wood, shone great golden stars, looking unfamiliar and grouped in strange constellations. He was sure they were arranged in some order which had a secret and malign significance. The wood on either side was full of singular noises, among which, once, twice, and again, he distinctly heard whispers in an unknown tongue. His neck was in pain, and lifting his head to it found it horribly swollen. He knew that it had a circle of black where the rope had bruised it. His eyes felt congested. He could no longer close them. His tongue was swollen with thirst. He relieved its fever by thrusting it forward from between his teeth into the cold air. How softly the turf had carpeted the untravelled avenue! He could no longer feel the roadway beneath his feet. Doubtless, despite his suffering, he had fallen asleep while walking. For now he sees another scene. Perhaps he has merely recovered from a delirium. He stands at the gate of his own house. All is as he left it, and all bright and beautiful in the morning sunshine. He must have travelled the entire night. As he pushes open the gate and passes by the wide, white walk, he sees a flutter of female garments. His wife, looking fresh and cool and sweet, steps down from the veranda to meet him. At the bottom of the steps she stands waiting, with a smile of ineffable joy, an attitude of matchless grace and dignity. Ah, how beautiful she is! He springs forwards with extended arms. As he is about to clasp her, he feels a stunning blow upon the back of the neck. A blinding white light blazes all about him, with a sound like the shock of a cannon. Then all is darkness and silence. Peyton Farquhar was dead. His body, with a broken neck, swung gently from side to side beneath the timbers of the Owl Creek Bridge. the end. This has been An Occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge by Ambrose Bierce. Year of publication, 1891. This work is in the public domain. Production and narration copyright, 2025. Jonathan Dunne. Ah, you made it. Good. Close the door, quickly. You feel that wind tonight? Ooh, that hail and sleet coming in off the Atlantic. Cut the nose right off your face, it would. Come nearer the fire. There's something I've never told you. Years ago, on a coast not far from here, at twilight, I saw a woman standing alone against a gale, standing atop the cliffs of Moher on the west coast of Ireland, staring out into the Atlantic Ocean. She just stood there, watching the surf as if it were speaking to her, with her shawl wrapped around her shoulders, her grey hair billowing out behind her. Later, much later, I heard what had been done to her. The laughter, the stones, the cruelty of men who thought themselves safe once the tide came in. Ha ha! But the sea is patient, my old friend. Never forget it. And it never sleeps. I have walked the same stretch of shore since, and I tell you this plainly. There are moments when the wind shifts, and you feel as though something is staring down from the top of those cliffs. Robert E. Howard must have had a similar experience. He called it sea curse. Some say it's fiction. I'm not entirely certain. Listen, and tell me, when it's over, whether you believe the sea remembers. Now, settle in. Let me lock that door. To be sure, as my dear old grandmother used to say. Ah, there she goes, my little cuckoo, with her 12 chimes, warning us that it's midnight. Sea Curse, written by Robert E. Howard. Narrated for you by Jonathan Dunne. Original year of publication, 1928. This work is in the public domain. Production and narration copyright, 2026. Jonathan Dunne. And some return by the failing light, and some in the waking dream. For she hears the heels of the dripping ghosts that ride the rough moonbeam. Kipling. They were the brawlers and braggarts, the loud boasters and hard drinkers of Fearing Town, John Culrick and his crony Lylip Canool. Many a time have I, a tousled-haired lad, stolen to the tavern door to listen to their curses, their profane arguments and wild sea songs. Half fearful and half in admiration of these wild rovers, aye, all the people of Fearing Town gazed on them with fear and admiration, for they were not like the rest of the faring men. They were not content to ply their trade along the coasts and among the shark-teethed shoals. No yawls, no skiffs for them. They feared farther than any other man in the village, for they shipped on the great sailing ships that went out on the white tides to brave the restless grey ocean and make ports in strange lands. Ah, I mind it was swift times in the little seacoast village of Fearing, when John Culrick came home with his furtive Lylip at his side, swaggering down the gangplank in his tarry sea clothes and the broad leather belt that held his ever-ready dagger, shouting condescending greeting to some favoured acquaintance, kissing some maiden who ventured too near, then up the street, roaring some scarcely decent song of the sea. How the cringers and the idlers, the hangers-on, would swarm about the two desperate heroes, flattering and smirking, guffawing hilariously at each nasty jest. For to the tavern loafers and to some of the weaker among the straightforward villagers, these men with their wild talk and their brutal deeds, their tales of the seven seas and the far countries, these men, I say, were valiant knights, nature's noblemen who dared to be men of blood and brawn. And all feared them, so that when a man was beaten or a woman insulted, the villagers muttered and did nothing. And so, when Moll Farrell's niece was put to shame by John Culrick, none dared even to put in words what all thought. Moll had never married, and she and the girl lived alone in a little hut down close to the beach. So close that in high tide the waves came almost up to the door. The people of the village accounted old Moll something of a witch, and she was a grim, gaunt old dame who had little to say to anyone. But she minded her own business, and eked out a slim living by gathering clams and picking up bits of driftwood. The girl was a pretty foolish little thing, vain and easily befooled, else she had never yielded to the shark-like blandishments of John Culrick. I mind the day was a cold winter day, with a sharp breeze out of the east when the old dame came into the village street, shrieking that the girl had vanished. All scattered over the beach and back among the bleak inland hills to search for her. All save John Culrick and his cronies, who sat in the tavern dicing and topping. All the while beyond the shoals we heard the never-ceasing droning of the heaving, restless grey monster, and the dim light of the ghostly dawn Moll Farrell's girl came home. The tides bore her gently across the wet sands, and lay her almost at her own door. Virgin white she was, and her arms were folded across her still bosom. Calm was her face, and the grey tide sighed about her slender limbs. Moll Farrell's eyes were stones, yet she stood above her dead girl and spoke no word till John Culrick and his crony came reeling down from the tavern, their drinking jacks still in their hands. Drunk was John Culrick, and the people gave back for him, murder in their souls. So he came and laughed at Moll Farrell across the body of her girl.
Zounds,
swore John Culrick.
the wench has drowned herself, Lylip.
Lylip laughed with the twist of his thin mouth. He always hated Moll Farrell, for it was she that had given him the name of Lylip. Then John Culrick lifted his drinking jack, swaying on his uncertain legs.
A health to the wench's ghost,
he bellowed, while all stood aghast. Then Moll Farrell spoke, and the words broke from her in a scream which sent ripples of cold up and down the spines of the throng.
The curse of the foul fiend upon you, John Culrick,
she screamed.
The curse of God rest upon your vile soul throughout eternity. May you gaze on sights that shall sear the eyes of you and scorch the soul of you. May you die a bloody death and writhe in hell's flames for 1,000,000 and 1,000,000 and yet 1,000,000 years. I curse you by sea and by land, by earth and by air, by the demons of the oceans and the demons of the swamplands, the fiends of the forests and the goblins of the hills, and you.
Her lean finger stabbed at Lylip Canoe, and he started backward, his face paling.
You shall be the death of John Culrick, and he shall be the death of you. You shall bring John Culrick to the doors of hell, and John Culrick shall bring you to the gallows tree. I set the seal of death upon your brow, John Culrick. You shall live in terror and die in horror far out upon the cold grey sea. But the sea that took the soul of innocence to her bosom shall not take you, but shall fling you forth, you vile carcass, to the sands. Aye, John Culrick.
And she spoke with such a terrible intensity that the drunken mockery on the man's face changed to one of swinish stupidity.
The sea roars for the victim it will not keep. There is snow upon the hills, John Culric, and ere it melts your corpse will lie at my feet, and I shall spit upon it and be content.
Culric and his cronies sailed at dawn for a long voyage, and Moll went back to her hut and her clam gathering. She seemed to grow leaner and more grim than ever, and her eyes smouldered with a light not sane. The days glided by, and people whispered among themselves that Moll's days were numbered, for she faded to a ghost of a woman. But she went her way, refusing all aid. That was a short, cold summer, and the snow on the barren inland hills never melted, a thing very unusual, which caused much comment among the villagers. At dusk and at dawn, Moll would come up on the beach, gaze up at the snow which glittered on the hills, then out to sea, with a fierce intensity in her gaze. Then the days grew shorter, the nights longer and darker, and the cold grey tides came sweeping along the bleak strands, bearing the rain and sleet of the sharp east breezes. And upon a bleak day a trading vessel sailed into the bay and anchored, and all the idlers and the wastrels flocked to the wharfs, for that was the ship upon which John Culric and Lylip Canool had sailed. Down the gangplank came Lylip, more furtive than ever, but John Culric was not there. To shouted queries, Canool shook his head.
Culric deserted ship at a port of Sumatra, said he. He had a row with the skipper, lads. Wanted me to desert too, but no. I had to see you fine lads again. Hey, boys?
Almost cringing was Lylip Canool, and suddenly he recoiled as Moll Farrell came through the throng. A moment they stood eyeing each other. Then Moll's grim lips bent in a terrible smile.
There's blood on your hand, Canool,
she lashed out suddenly, so suddenly that Lylip started and rubbed his right hand across his left sleeve.
Stand aside, witch,
he snarled in sudden anger, striding through the crowd which gave back for him. His admirers followed him to the tavern. Now, I mind that the next day was even colder. Grey fogs came drifting out of the east and veiled the sea and the beaches. There would be no sailing that day, and so all the villagers were in their snug houses or matching tales at the tavern. So it came about that Joe, my friend, a lad of my own age, and I were the ones who saw the first of the strange thing that happened. Being harum-scarum lads of no wisdom, we were sitting in a small rowboat, floating at the end of the wharves, each shivering and wishing the other would suggest leaving, there being no reason whatever for our being there, save that it was a good place to build air castles undisturbed. Suddenly Joe raised his hand.
Say, he said, do you hear? Who can be out on the bay on a day like this?
Nobody. What do you hear? Oars, or I'm a lubber. Listen. There was no seeing anything in that fog, and I heard nothing. Yet Joe swore he did, and suddenly his face assumed a strange look. Somebody rowing out there, I tell you. The bay is alive with oars from the sound. A score of boats at the least. Yet, dolt, can you not hear? Then, as I shook my head, he leapt and began to undo the painter. I'm off to sea. Name me liar if the bay is not full of boats, altogether like a close fleet. Are you with me? Yes, I was with him, though I heard nothing. Then out in the greyness we went, and the fog closed behind and before, so that we drifted in a vague world of smoke, seeing nought and hearing nought. We were lost in no time, and I cursed Joe for leading us upon a wild goose chase that was like to end with our being swept out to sea. I thought of Moll Farrell's girl, and shuddered. How long we drifted, I know not. Minutes faded into hours, hours into centuries. Still Joe swore he heard the oars, now close at hand, now far away. And for hours we followed them, steering our course toward the sound as the noise grew or receded. This I later thought of, and could not understand. Then, when my hands were so numb that I could no longer hold the oar, and the forerunning drowsiness of cold and exhaustion was stealing over me, bleak white stars broke through the fog, which glided suddenly away, fading like a ghost of smoke, and we found ourselves afloat just outside the mouth of the bay. The waters lay smooth as a pond, all dark green and silver in the starlight, and the cold came crisper than ever. I was swinging the boat about to put back into the bay when Joe gave a shout, and for the first time I heard the clack of oarlocks. I glanced over my shoulder, and my blood went cold. A great beaked prow loomed above us, a weird, unfamiliar shape against the stars, and as I caught my breath, sheered sharply and swept by us with a curious swishing, sheered sharply and swept by us with a curious swishing I never heard any other craft make. Joe screamed and backed oars frantically, and the boat walled out of the way just in time. For though the prow had missed us, still otherwise we had died. For from the sides of the ship stood long oars, bank upon bank which swept her along. Though I had never seen such a craft, I knew her for a galley. But what was she doing upon our coasts? They said, the farfarers, that such ships were still in use among the heathens of Barbary. But it was many a long heaving mile to Barbary, and even so she did not resemble the ships described by those who had sailed far. We started in pursuit, and this was strange, for though the waters broke about her prow, and she seemed fairly to fly through the waves, yet she was making little speed, and it was no time before we caught up with her. Making our painter fast to a chain far back beyond the reach of the swishing oars, we hailed those on deck, but there came no answer. And at last, conquering our fears, we clambered up the chain and found ourselves upon the strangest deck man has trod for many a long roaring century. "This is no Barbary rover," muttered Joe fearsomely. "Look how old it seems. Almost ready to fall to pieces. Why, it is fairly rotten." There was no one on deck, no one at the long sweep with which the craft was steered. We stole to the hold and looked down the stair. Then and there, if ever men were on the verge of insanity, it was we. For there were rowers there, it is true. They sat upon the rowers' benches and drove the creaking oars through the grey waters. And they that rowed were skeletons. Shrieking, we plunged across the deck to fling ourselves into the sea. But at the rail I tripped upon something and fell headlong, and as I lay I saw a thing which vanquished my fear of the horrors below for an instant. The thing upon which I had tripped was a human body, and in the dim grey light that was beginning to steal across the eastern waves I saw a dagger hilt standing up between his shoulders. Joe was at the rail, urging me to haste, and together we slid down the chain and cut the painter. Then we stood off into the bay. Straight on kept the grim galley, and we followed, slowly wandering. She seemed to be heading straight for the beach beside the wharves, and as we approached, we saw the wharfs thronged with people. They had missed us, no doubt, and now they stood there in the early dawn lights, struck dumb by the apparition which had come up out of the night and the grim ocean. Straight on swept the galley, her oars a swish. Then ere she reached the shallow water, crash! A terrific reverberation shook the bay. Before our eyes the grim craft seemed to melt away. Then she vanished, and the green water seethed where she had ridden. But there floated no driftwood there, nor did there ever float any ashore. Aye, something floated ashore, but it was grim driftwood. We made the landing amid a hum of excited conversation that stopped suddenly. Moll Farrell stood before her hut, limbed gauntly against the ghostly dawn, her lean hand pointing seaward. And across the sighing wet sands borne by the grey tide, something came floating, something that the waves dropped at Moll Farrell's feet. And there looked up at us, as we crowded about, a pair of unseeing eyes set in a still white face. John Culrick had come home. Still and grey he lay, rocked by the tide, and as he lurched sideways, all saw the dagger hilt that stood from his back. The dagger all of us had seen 1,000 times at the belt of Lylip Canul. I killed him, came Canul's shriek, as he writhed and grovelled before our gaze. At sea, on a still night in a drunken brawl, I slew him and hurled him overboard, and from the far seas he has followed me. His voice sank to a hideous whisper. Because of the curse, the sea would not keep his body. And the wretch sank down, trembling, the shadow of the gallows already in his eyes. Aye, strong, deep, and exultant was Moll Farrell's voice. From the hell of lost craft, Satan sent a ship of bygone ages, a ship red with gore and stained with the memory of horrid crimes. None other would bear such a vile carcass. The sea has taken vengeance, and has given me mine. See now how I spit upon the face of John Culrick. And with a ghastly laugh, she pitched forward, the blood starting to her lips. And the sun came up across the restless sea. Howard leaves us there, with the tide rolling in, with justice neither clean nor merciful. No thunderclap, no triumphant reckoning, just the sea doing what it has always done. I have walked along coasts after storms. I've seen what the water returns, bits of rope, splintered wood, and shiny things men thought were lost. Cruelty has a way of lingering, and the sea, patient, vast and cold, does not forget, and is unforgiving. If tonight's tale unsettled you, good. Some stories should. They remind us that even the smallest act can echo farther than we imagine. Come lurking back in on the crest of a wave, you might say. Thank you for sitting by the fire with me. Until next time, mind the tide. This has been The Sea Curse, written by Robert E. Howard. Narrated for you by Jonathan Dunne. Original year of publication 1928. This work is in the public domain. Production and narration copyright 2026. Jonathan Dunne. This has been Timeless Terrors Volume 15, performed for you by Jonathan Dunne. Production and narration copyright 2026. Jonathan Dunne.